A few years ago, I traveled from Taiwan to South Africa for work. I stayed a few days in Johannesburg and then in Cape Town. First things first, I loved it there. A unique culture I never experienced before, a stunningly beautiful place, and friendly people for the most part. Upon returning, I read Trevor Noah's memoir about his life growing up in apartheid and enjoyed it. But a brief mention of Chinese people in the book caught my attention and got me started on what would eventually be this video. In this video, I want to talk about the Chinese diaspora in South Africa, their journey to South Africa, their history, what their life was like in this super interesting, super multicultural African country. But first, I want to talk about the Patreon a little bit. For those who've not signed up to the early access tier, I want to call out a few of the videos queued up and waiting to soon be released. Right now, I'm working on a video about the attempted acquisition of Qualcomm by Singaporean giant Broadcom. So head on over to the Patreon page and take a look. I would deeply appreciate anything you'd be able to give, and thank you. Back to the show. Has Geography Now made a video about South Africa yet? If so, go watch that first, or hit up the Wikipedia article if you want to get a comprehensive overview. Or you can listen to me for a few minutes. I'm going to do my best to set the stage and condense 100,000 years of highly charged colonial history, human cruelty, and environmental exploitation into a short 5-minute segment, maybe even less. South Africa is a large country in the southern hemisphere. It is big, 5 times the size of its former colonizer, the United Kingdom, and is home to 59 million people. That is about the same as the European country Italy, or China's 12th most populous province, Anhui. The country is extremely multi-ethnic. 80% of the population is Black African, but there also are sizable minority populations of whites, Asians, and colored. The reasons for this multi-ethnicity is colonialism and slavery. White Europeans first came to what is now South Africa en masse in the early 17th century. White colonists, mostly Dutch but including others, carved out homes in the rough soil. They fought rough conflicts with the black tribes living there, pushing them out. In the 1860s and 70s, gold and diamonds were discovered in the Inner Plains, and that brought about an economic boom, and so another series of wars. At this point in time, slaves and indentured workers were imported by companies seeking to exploit their labor to mine for precious minerals. Keep in mind this part. The British expanded out of their colony in Cape Town, conquering the various warring tribes, white and black, to create the Union of South Africa. The Union was originally set up to be a federation like Canada and Australia, but soon left the Commonwealth and became an independent republic. Then after, the National Party ascended to power and formalized a series of racial segregation policies called apartheid. That lasted until the early 1990s, when various social movements inside and outside of the country caused the government to disassemble apartheid. The African National Congress, an anti-apartheid political movement, has been in power ever since, with varying degrees of popularity. Lord, I left so much out. I apologize to all those marginalized. The Chinese story in South Africa is not dissimilar to that which took place in Australia, Canada, and the United States, and that makes sense considering the shared colonial history of these nations. Chinese men have been traveling abroad to find work for a very long time. They were valued by colonial leaders for their hardworking attitude and diligence. When Cape Town was first founded in 1652 by members of the United East India Company, the Dutch requested 100 Chinese laborers to be brought to their new colony. Jan van Riebeck, expedition leader and colonial administrator, had worked with Chinese laborers in the Dutch colony of Java, now in Indonesia, and held good views of their diligence. He called them efficient, industrious gardeners, and thought they would help cultivate the rich land there. This request was not granted. This is the first instance you will see to be of a frequent trend. On one hand, you have colonials, generally business owners or administrators, who see Chinese laborers as good workers and want more imported so to benefit from their labor. And then you have another group of colonists who resent the competition for the same jobs and labor, see the Chinese as perpetual foreigners, and want them banned from their lands. The first such Chinese immigrants were sent in 1652 from the Dutch colony of Batavia, what is now Jakarta, as part of a shipment that included Malays, Indonesians, and Indians. They were generally the worst of the lot, criminals, thieves, and a few political exiles. They came to serve their punishment, and many returned to China after said sentence was completed. A few Chinese did remain, however, and they lived in settlements of their own. Such Chinese were called and referred to as free blacks, a term that applied to anyone with either black or Asian descent. They opened restaurants, sold nice candles, and of course engaged in petty thievery. There were about 2,000 such Chinese living in Cape Town with origins from China's southern provinces, and they mostly spoke Cantonese or Hakka. Free Chinese were generally treated with contempt, given status barely above that of slaves, but people admired their handiwork and or feared their economic competition. This prevented their large-scale import until the arrival of the gold rush. South Africa's gold rush began in the 1870s and attracted people from all around the world. A small handful of Chinese men began arriving at Cape Town from China's southern provinces and other colonies like Batavia. China at this time was not a good place to live. I wrote a bit about the major trends happening at the Chinese homeland in my video about Chinese immigration to Singapore, and there are interesting parallels there. You can watch that one to learn more. But to sum things up, you have a titanic civil war with the Taiping Rebellion, major famines that resulted from it, and new state-sponsored immigration of Chinese people in order to relieve labor shortages in the various colonies around the world. The result was widespread immigration and settlement by Chinese workers. From 1904 to 1907, 63,695 Chinese were brought to South Africa to work the mines of Witwatersrand. As you might imagine, conditions back then for a Chinese gold miner were not all that great. Contemporary humanitarians may have exaggerated the worst of the abuses, but it was not exactly the Ritz-Carlton. The work was hard and inherently dangerous. Chinese were paid even less than Africans, 37 shillings 6 pence a month, as opposed to 52 shillings a month for the Africans. Despite this, the wage rates were said to be so much higher compared to what can be had in Qing-era Guangdong, estimated to be around 2 pence a day, that potential recruits thought it was all a scam and refused to sign up. In addition to the low pay, workers were frequently subject to corporal punishment whenever they made trouble. Reports record situations like the one to follow. A compound manager got 2 police boys, one to hold the Chinese victim by the head and the other by the legs on the ground, while the compound manager flogged him. Here's another. Li Kuei was in the habit of flogging coolies, and in one case tied a coolie up by the thumbs. It was difficult to get coolies to give evidence as they were afraid of Li. As the passage above implies, I want to note here that many of the people doing the flogging were themselves Chinese. This tough treatment eventually led to riots and criminal behaviors from the laborers. It cannot be denied that Chinese labor workers committed a disproportional number of crimes, including assault, public violence, theft, and murder. Colonial-era Singapore wasn't that great either, just to compare. A public outcry will result from the farmers and colonists living in the area. People demanded an end to the yellow peril. This Transvaal experiment, as it's called, where laborers from China and India were imported and given the right to stay, would have major historical repercussions in future years. A significant portion of the 64,000 Chinese brought to Johannesburg perished laboring in the mines. Their bodies can still be found in unmarked graves around the city. Those who survived would be forced to return to China. This is in contrast with the situation in Singapore, where Chinese immigration continued unrestricted until well into the 20th century. Regardless, fear of the Chinese mine workers with their funny pigtails and weird language possibly settling in the colonies would lead to restrictive legislation. Acts were passed to restrict Chinese people's ability to mine, trade, sell goods, and buy property. The free Chinese who had been living in the colonies would suffer greatly from this. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1902 was the first act passed seeking to prevent Chinese from entering and staying in the colonies. It is said that unless an Asiatic could speak a European language, they could not enter South Africa. This effectively pinched off what little immigration was happening into the colonies at the time. 2 years later, Cape Town passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1904, which banned Chinese from entering or holding citizenship in the Cape. This was done in response to the aforementioned Transvaal experiment further inland. Cape Towners did not want any free Chinese entering their colony, and possibly even, gasp, living there. Heaven forbid such a travesty were to occur. This ban would last for 3 decades. This legislation was in line, tragically, with others passed in Australia and the United States in response to what is called the Yellow Peril. There was protest, of course. The Chinese government at the time voiced its anger at the law. Chinese communities in South Africa wrote letters to London and other leaders in the community, but regardless, the law stayed. These bans were lifted after World War II, largely as a result of the Chinese war effort against Japan. I did a video about this in the United States. This change meant that small populations of Chinese would come and try to make their homes in the South African nation. Well, and then apartheid came. Apartheid in South Africa was the legalized segregation of people on the basis of race or ethnicity. The politics behind why and how apartheid happened are beyond the scope of this video, but it is really fascinating and I recommend you read up on it separately. For now, let us stay with the Chinese. This is going to be long. In order to execute on this segregation idea, you first need to know what race those people were. The South African government increasingly made use of census data until 1950, when it passed the first of two major pieces of apartheid legislation, the Population Registration Act of 1950. The Population Registration Act would create the racial groups, whites and not whites. Within the not white group, we have the Asians, the blacks, and the coloreds. The last category, the coloreds, is a catch-all category for everyone else. The Asians were made up of mostly Indians and Chinese until 1984, when the government reclassified the Chinese as honorary whites. This little bit of policy hypocrisy was noted in the Trevor Noah book and will be addressed later. Being Chinese in apartheid South Africa was a study in societal confusion. There were relatively few Chinese in those years, so their application of apartheid law was inconsistent. People who lived from that era recounted not being sure which side they belonged to, a sort of in-between feeling. One very real example of this comes from buying stamps. I remember I must have been 10 years old when my late dad asked me to go down to the post office down the road to buy stamps. When I went to the colored side, because back then it was white and not white, the chap shouts at me and says to go to the other side. When I went to the other side, I was told the same thing. So I stood outside and the first person that came by, I asked him to buy a stamp for me. The second major apartheid law, the Group Areas Act of 1950, assigned each racial group to an area of their own. This meant that non-whites cannot live in the developed white areas. Chinese at that time made their living as traders between the various races, so this directly affected their financial livelihood. It was a big concern. For the next 10 or 20 years, they were forced into a legalized in-between status. For example, they were forbidden from purchasing homes anywhere as they did not have a land of their own. So they had to rent shop fronts and homes from landlords, which left them very vulnerable. But starting in the 1970s, Chinese people had risen up in social and economic status, and as a result could buy land in white areas if their white neighbors approved. Chinese remembered the humiliation of having to knock on white people's homes so that they can ask for permission to move in. This restriction would be removed in the mid-1980s after the reclassification of the Chinese race. In 1984, the Chinese people were defined by the government to be white. The reasons for doing so likely had to do with warming ties between South Africa and Taiwan, as well as the inconveniences of applying the increasingly impractical apartheid law to a tiny Chinese community, at that time numbering just 10,000 out of 32 million. As South Africa and Taiwan found themselves increasingly isolated in the international community, South Africa because of apartheid and Taiwan because of China, the two increasingly traded with each other. By 1979, South Africa exported 180 million rand of raw goods, mostly corn, to Taiwan. Taiwan, for their part, had risen to become apartheid South Africa's fifth largest trading partner overall. In 1980, Taiwanese Premier Sun Yat-sen made an official state visit to South Africa. As many pointed out, it is hard to be so friendly with Taiwan, but treat their people at the same time as secondary citizens. 1985 came at a turbulent period in South African history. Europe had begun imposing economic sanctions for apartheid and political violence was breaking out all across the country. The small Chinese community had no vote due to their in-between status and activists pressured the government to do something about it. And as it turns out, there was literally no bureaucratic way to grant them the vote except to make them an honorary white alongside the Japanese. Side note, the Japanese, for their part, had been honorary white since the early 1960s, and it was not like the hypocrisy was ignored even at that time. Opposing party officials, as well as the Chinese ambassador at the time, blasted the National Party for choosing this one race to be such privilege, for trade reasons. Of course, it made no sense back then, but as Noah wrote, apartheid in general made no sense from the very start. To their credit, the Chinese community in South Africa realized the political risk of publicly accepting these privileges. By this time, the days of white rule looked numbered, and the white reclassification looked like a poisoned chalice. For their part, the official Chinese community in South Africa, CASA, declined to accept the reclassification, publicly announcing that they were seeking a representative constitutional solution for all South Africans, not just the Chinese. Historian Kevin Scott Wong once wrote with regard to the history of the Chinese in America that historians cared more about what was done to them rather than their actual achievements in their new home. I personally feel similarly about the Chinese in South Africa. So much information about the laws discriminating against them, or excluding them, not enough about what their actual lives were like back then. What I did find, I was able to share with you. Throughout this history, the Chinese were seen as perpetual foreigners. Many things were said about them, but what those things were depended largely on the aims and goals of the people saying them. For instance, for those ship captains wanting to bring Chinese labor to Cape Town, the Chinese are hard-working and diligent peoples, great for gardening. To the colonial administrators seeking to keep Cape Town white only, the Chinese are villainous and cunning, undercutting wages and making things worse and harder for everyone else. Throughout apartheid, the Chinese community sought to make better for their own people, differentiating themselves from the rest of the non-white category. They knew that doing so might cause issues for them later down the line, that the other races will remember their attempts to, quote, leave them behind, end quote. But at the same time, the Chinese needed to look out for themselves as well. Balancing between the two interests was immensely challenging, but eventually, that small community found a small niche for itself. I have to end with this. After apartheid fell and relations with the People's Republic warmed, a wave of Chinese from the mainland have come to South African shores. Born of a different culture, they are now bringing a new dynamic to the old Chinese groups. Yet another new fascinating diversity to the already super diverse South African community. Alright everyone, even though I wrote something like 3,000 words about this whole topic, I still feel like I missed so much. But that is how it is with lots of these things, especially when you're covering 500 years of history. Alright everybody, take care of yourselves out there. Hope to see or hear from you again soon. See you later.